I'm Christoph van Tomme, and welcome to the API Resilience Podcast. If you've ever wondered what it really is we do when we do APIs, and if you've wondered how APIs change organizations, our communities, and our society, look no further. This is the podcast you've been searching for.
In this episode, Christoph van Tomme has two guests, Michael Hibay and Mike Amundsen. Michael Hibay is an API evangelist, CTO, Java developer, and open source contributor working to drive the adoption and evolution of digital businesses using API-first strategies. He is a strong privacy, security, and governance advocate, constantly seeking to build secure guardrails to maintain safety at the speed of digital businesses. Mike Amundsen is an internationally known author and speaker. He travels the world discussing network architecture, web development, and the intersection of technology and society. He works with companies large and small to help them capitalize on the opportunities provided by APIs, microservices, and digital transformation.
I'm super excited today because I've got two amazing guests to talk about a topic that's it's like for the connoisseurs, the whole hypermedia topic, which is, it's like a cult. It has a cult following in API circles. It's a little bit like the semantic web. Everybody keeps talking about it, how awesome it's going to be when we finally are able to do it. And then, but then it keeps like taking more and more and more time. And that topic is hypermedia APIs. And so today I've got Mike Amundsen and Mike Hibay, and I'm going to call Mike Hibay Michael, just to make the distinction, to make it a little bit easier. So I'm super excited because this is going to be an awesome conversation, and I'm just really looking forward to learning a lot more and kind of like seeing the big picture of how is hypermedia going to enable AI, or how is AI going to enable hypermedia APIs, and how is that going to change the API landscape? Welcome, Mike and Michael, to the API Resilience Podcast. Really, really happy to have you here.
First of all, let me just say it's great to talk with you, Christoph. And before we started the recording, Michael and I were just talking. For a while, we would see each other at least once a year. We would see each other at ResFest or something else, some other event. And it's been years since we had a chance to talk with each other. So I'm very excited as well about today, because this is a chance for me to learn what Michael's been working on. And I also always love your perspective on things. So I'm just very, very excited to be here. And I'm looking forward to a very interesting session.
Yeah, likewise, I'll mirror those. It has been a while, and I'm really looking forward to speaking with Mike, and Christoph is always a great conversation enabler. We seem to find great conversations to have, and so it's always a lot of fun. So it's really great to be on there again.
Maybe as like a first intro, because I went to ResFest Edinburgh, I don't know how many years ago. This was my second API conference. My first API conference was, I think, API Days Paris, and then I straight went for the deep plunge. I had no idea I was up for deep plunge because I showed up. I don't know if you remember this, Mike, but I showed up in Edinburgh with a colleague, with Tamesh. We showed up. Was like, oh, this is a lot less people than I thought it was going to be, and like, oh my God. So we need to do a presentation. Like, how is this going to go?
Yeah. It was a very, like when you talk about the deep end, it's a very different kind of swimming pool, right? The idea there is not a lot of people, lots of high touch, face to face. And what was our line was everybody talks and everybody listens, right? Like everybody gets to do a presentation and stuff like that. So yeah, it was a very different experience. I loved the ResFests. I think I learned more at the ResFest experiences than I did at any other conference. And it was always a really enlightening experience. And I really enjoyed the Edinburgh one. I think it was, did we do two ever in Edinburgh? Maybe only one, I can't recall. But it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. I love the city. I remember your session, Thomas, and it was quite exciting. It was a lot of fun.
So it was really surprising for me that you also knew each other from ResFest, and that you also have that shared history, right?
Well, I was actually about to bring that up as well. Funnily enough, RESTfest was actually my first API conference, so I wasn't really sure too much. I think I'd watched every video that was online of that, and pretty much every other conference that I could get a hold of. But that was my introduction. So I dipped my toes in pretty deep to start it out with, and didn't really realize how deep until later. So maybe ignorance is bliss to get me started.
Well, so I have to ask for both of you. Was it a kind of a scary experience that very first time?
No, it was the best for me to kind of get started. It really kind of set me up, because without knowing it, I'd actually done something that was really hard, and I was going to have 2 talks at a conference in a couple of months, and that would have been my first go with that. So it was wonderful to kind of really break the ice and get some great feedback.
There you go.
For me, it was first it was like, oh God, where's the kiddie pool? Because, but then
I must be in the wrong room.
But then it was amazing, because my best conferences have always been these participatory conferences where, even if you're coming in with less knowledge up front, you're still accepted and welcomed. And that just, well, for me, that's why I love community and all the different communities that I participate in. And RESTfest was one of those communities that was really welcoming and open.
That was always the hope, right? The hope was that it was a welcoming and safe and friendly place. And it was really about connections. It was really about getting to meet people you wouldn't normally meet, getting to hear people you normally wouldn't hear. Benjamin Young really came up with this idea originally, and I jumped on it right away. And it came from an event where you had to have a peer-reviewed paper before you began. You were allowed to speak. And that limited the number of people who could speak and the kind of people who could speak. That meant people who knew how to write and so on and so forth. And we wanted to kind of change that up and make it so that anyone and everyone would have a chance to talk. And those connections really are what hypermedia is about, right? I mean, just to kind of do a blend here, it's like how you connect things and then come up with something that's greater than the sum of its parts. And that's why we had so much fun with that event. I think it was like 10 years. I think we had 10 or 11 RESTfests before the pandemic finally shut us down. But I always enjoyed it very, very much. Yeah.
Yeah, it was great. It was great. It introduced me to the love of kind of, sharing my knowledge and teaching people. That was kind of one of the things that kind of blindsided me, as I really went there to kind of learn and speak with and kind of, test what I knew against the experts, right? To like see what I didn't know, but what I found was really rather surprising, at least at the time for me, was that actually kind of the less experienced, less expert people that were kind of just being inundated with all this, it was just really, really rewarding to kind of like see those constant sparks of understanding and really kind of participate in that. It was surprising to me, and it's one of the best things that's come from it, from my perspective.
And all of that is an introduction to the topic of RESTfest, which is So the topic of RESTfest, which is hypermedia APIs. But Mike, you were kind of hinting at it, that maybe there's a new word coming. Can you maybe, just for our audience, explain a little bit what is a hypermedia API, and how is that not your grandpa's API, or how is that different?
Well, yeah, sure. The notion of hypermedia APIs is this notion that the response carries instructions. The hypermedia part comes from a long line of over 100 years of thinking on this topic of connecting information together. One of the oldest connections I know of that's been written up quite a bit, Paul Otley, a Belgian, at the turn of the last century, like in the 1920s, teens and 20s, talked about this idea of connecting radio and opera houses and video, like film and movies, and printed material all together into a kind of city of information. And having an electronic device in the home that allowed you to watch and listen to whatever you wanted. He actually created a search, kind of a reference system where you would mail in a question, and all these workers would collect up answers and then send a response. So it's like Google search over, postal service in the 1920s and 30s. He was a very creative guy, and he always talked about connections. And this connection talk into the 20s and 30s through the wars lands in another place, which is actually the Oppenheimer movie that everybody's really excited about right now. There's a person in the Oppenheimer movie by the name of Vannevar Bush, who was one of the project managers of the bomb project. Vannevar Bush had this idea when he watched how all the scientists worked together, that they were connecting ideas together. He envisioned a kind of a desk where you had microfilm and you could read all of this material and cross-reference material, even imagine a sort of a thing on the top of your head, which is sort of a light source that would like point to things and the machine would somehow understand. That becomes Ted Nelson's hypermedia, the guy who invents the word hypermedia, hypertext, hyperlink, hyperdata. So Ted Nelson in the late 60s, early 70s is envisioning how mainframes can become responsive machines for individuals rather than just run jobs. And that becomes, all sorts of things that we eventually call the web, that Tim Berners-Lee talks about, and all the links and all the forms. That was Ted Nelson's kind of thinking of hypermedia, and that was Tim Berners-Lee way of kind of creating that. So that all goes through, a brief history of all of that material, and we've called that lots and lots of things. We've called it the web. The web was full of links. I think, Tim's line was some kind of medium where you could move from node to node and make connections or something like that. It gets a little bit more, philosophical and PhD-able with a guy by the name of Roy Fielding, who kind of invents a kind of a model for explaining how this all works. And his line is, the information becomes the affordance. Like, the information you get back tells you what you can do next. Affordance is from a guy by the name of Gibson in the 1960s. So all of this leads to this idea of REST. And REST was Fielding's way of creating a model that explained how links and forms together, along with some other rules, makes a resilient system. A system that doesn't have to have a central location, that doesn't have to have one major server that everybody has to check in with, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of a super brief version. So a lot of people called that REST. We're going to call it REST. But REST kind of gets lots and lots of uses and lots of names. So I and Mike Kelly and people like Mike Hibay and others, we started just saying hypermedia. We started going back to the Ted Nelson stuff from the 60s and 70s. So hypermedia was the links in the forums, and you could put links in forums and APIs. And now I gotta say, to kind of just get to the quick end, I think hypermedia might not be the best name for what we're facing today. What we're seeing today are the possibility of intelligent machines, we call them AI, robots, parsers, whatever, that can understand language and understand other content really, really closely. And what are they looking for? They're looking for something inside the message. You know what they're looking for? They're looking for affordances. How can I find the subject of this paragraph? How can I find the link between this paper and that paper? They're looking for affordances, just like all these other characters have been looking for affordances over the last 100 years. So I tend to start talking about programming affordances. When you're really in a prompt with GPT, or you're in Perplexity AI or any of these other tools, you're creating an affordance, or you're telling it to look for an affordance, or you're telling it to create an afforded response. So I think, I don't know, Michael, you've been working in this space. Does any of that kind of make sense to you in terms of the way I'm thinking about this?
Well, I mean, my neck is going to be sore from all the nodding I have going on here, but it's a kind of convergent design. Affordance is really kind of a lot of the word. No shock, really, because a lot of this I learned kind of at your behest and from a lot of your work in the past. But affordance is really the word that I've landed on for describing a lot of these things. In fact, previous conversations I had with Christoph was about affordance catalogs rather than API catalogs.
Really?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Wait a minute. What is an affordance catalog? I missed this.
It came from this idea that the best API is an API that surprises you in its usage, that people can find new affordances in it.
Yes.
And that's so you like the real beauty of API first businesses is that basically they enable emergent capabilities to be built in the communities that are layered on top of those APIs that they're providing. And that's one of the key things that I thought that a developer portal should be able to do, or like the place where you're documenting your APIs, is that you are exposing the affordances that other people have discovered in the APIs that you're exposing. So that's and that this becomes, instead of our team publishes APIs, kind of like a broadcast thing, it becomes an interactive thing where together with the communities you're interacting with, you're exploring and you're identifying new ways of doing things with the capabilities you have in your organization or in the systems that you're exposing through APIs. That was kind of like the idea. The reality, though, so far, we've been talking about this in our company, but we haven't actually executed on it yet. But it's something. I was super excited about this because I think this is where there's a lot of value for organizations and for the communities. Because APIs become kind of like a stigmergic thing. Like the way that ants find their food, they're like, there's no manager. There's just a bunch of ants that have some basic rules, and they just follow, and there's a very, very core principle that helps to discover what's out there or what are the possibilities. So something like that I'm imagining that would be possible with this. And then that would also allow those organizations that apply this, that they're really learning from their communities much faster, and that they're investigating and exploring what is possible, what is the new possible out there. Yes.
I like that you mentioned ant colonies, because I've also done a few talks on the parallels for ant colonies. This idea that we have this myth that there's a queen ant, right? Which it doesn't really exist at all. They're really it's a sort of an organism, and that people take on roles based on what they're needed, whether I need to defend the nest or tend the babies or look for food or so on and so forth. And your role changes over time based on what the colony needs. But it's all based on this idea of group interaction and signaling back and forth, which I really love that idea. So Michael, have you had a chance to talk about this idea of this, what did you say, affordance catalog, right? Is that right?
I think we talked with Christoph a couple times. This came up in a previous, I think actually on this podcast, previous conversation, and we had a discussion in New York at API Days recently, a couple months ago. I haven't been able to kind of get around to do talks centered around it. I would just add, in addition to what Christoph was saying, he's really talking about a lot of the business value, the potential, looking more at kind of the nuts and bolts, kind of describing what this is. It's really vocabulary maintenance and kind of a really strong influence of domain-driven design. And so that description and understanding of what you're trying to accomplish is really the focus, rather than trying to have, let's say, a data-centric or a internal state property-centric kind of trigger for things. If you want to release a new version of a document, don't have a property of version number that you increment. You execute the release affordance, and that internally really kind of shades of OO as well, is what will increment the version number, right? So it's really about the language, the vocabulary being exposed by affordances to make it really more intuitive to interact with.
Yeah, a couple of things come to mind when I hear you two talk about this. So the first one that came to mind was a quote from Donald Norman, which was, the sign of a well-designed object is that it affords things that the designer never thought of. Right?
Ooh,
It's
that's
this
a good
notion that there's discoverable things in the thing that you built. And I think those of us who've designed anything like systemic, a large system, or maybe a programming language, or some other kind of vocabulary-based system, we've probably experienced that, where you set something up and you sort of set it on its way. It's sort of like your little birthing moment there. You like put it out in the world, and you come back later and somebody says, "Oh yeah, you just plugged the Frabisan into the hookja and it worked." And you're like, "What? What is that? I never knew you could." "Oh yeah, it works great. It was fine. We just have to kind of yank on it a little bit." And I'm saying, wow, never, and then you get that sort of creative moment. So that's one of the things. I think this idea of sort of cataloging what you discover sounds really, really intriguing. The other thing that sounds fascinating to me, and Mike, you made a couple of references to this. There's some domain-driven design in this, right? Because there's ubiquitous language and other things that we can think about, as well as this sort of. I love the notion when you talk about you don't flip the bit on the version that gets changed by an action, right? And I've tended to be very action oriented in my designing, to the point where I've somewhat caustically said that data is just the evidence, the leftover evidence of some action that's occurred, right? It's just the remainder, and it's handy, but the important thing is the action. Another way I've thought about it is people don't really care about your data; they care about what they can do with it, and that action approach. So, and that is very much at counter to a lot of people I talk to and work with who are very data focused, data driven organizations, data driven decision making, data integrity, data protection, data at rest, data at flight, that kind of thing. And I think of it slightly differently. So I'm fascinated by what you're talking about.
That's maybe this is another conversion kind of design kind of thing, because I often go after that. And I think that data is an often really misused word in this kind of case, because really what people are after is information, right? Or insight, really. We're talking much higher up the stack, right? But, without having, a priori design, we can't have insight, and information is much a struggle. So we'll settle with data as our acceptable, way of doing it, right? And it's just kind of a post hoc way of kind of trying to climb back up that meaning ladder. And really the insight is do it beforehand, right? Are you going to get everything? No. But if you take shorter, quicker loops, you'll be able to kind of design and capture, instead of trying to recreate lossy information. And so you said that's somewhat caustic. I've gotten a little bit more caustic, but I'm not sure that's public ready for the, to be put out there. But that's really kind of the key behind this idea is that you don't want to be going after the data. You want the insight, the information. But if you make everything a CRUD operation and there's tons of properties, you can't know what the person is trying to do. You don't know what the intent of the user is, right? And this really sprawls out to when you're building a API platform or a platform for an enterprise. When you start talking security and all these other things, what's important is intent and what's happening in insight. Is this a real person? Is this a bad actor, right? Is this a bot, right? That's the insight that you're trying to understand. And you make that very difficult if you lose that context and you don't design your system to kind of capture that context from the beginning.
Yeah, I think what again, I agree with you 100%. I think one of the things that a trap I fall into is that modeling is such an entertaining endeavor. Me modeling the world, me modeling this tiny little set of steps and so forth. So I'm suddenly, very, very excited. I got all of my endorphins running because I created a model. Of course, that model is just me, right? That model is not the world. That model is just my overlay on top of it. It's entertaining as it is, and maybe I can get others to enjoy that as well. But it's just a model, right? Like you were saying, Michael, the data is the actual, like what's the information that's going on. So me learning to be very, not model less, but less modelly has really helped me in this notion of thinking about actions and connections, what we would call hypermedia or finding affordances. So I find that much more sustainable over time. You talked about how you can build on it. What's the line? Every complex system started out as a simple system. Every successful complex system started out as a simple, successful system. You don't start by building a complicated thing. You start by building an easy, simple thing first.
I don't know if you guys are familiar with Alicia Juarero's work. You really need to go and check her work out. She's amazing.
Excellent.
She's got a new book out, which is Context Changes Everything, which is about, and she has this, she did a previous book about called Dynamics in Action, which is about enabling and governing constraints. And it's, for me, this was this eye opener because it like, when we do software, we're trying to make something that's going to act predictable. Like you edge cases are bad. Like you don't want stuff, like you don't want to be surprised by your software. Like at least like traditionally, but that's not how nature works. That's not how we work.
Right.
Also, that's not what we expect from something like AI agents. We want to be
not
surprised.
How resilient is born either. Yeah,
exactly. So it's this: how do you build resilient architecture, and how is that different from the way we do software traditionally? Like traditionally, it was this highly constrained. We're going to try to understand everything that possibly can happen, and we're going to create, something that's going to catch everything. And it feels to me that now it's the entrance of, or the explosion of AI on the scene, that this paradigm is shifting, and that we're now going for systems where we're actually embracing emergent behavior. And we're looking for things that are like suddenly doing something new and interesting. So her work, so Alicia Juarero's work, for me was gave me a framework to think about how to design or how to understand and evolve systems, because you don't always design them, but like how to understand complex systems and how you could use constraints and understanding about constraints to evolve them.
Yeah, so this is very, very fascinating to me. I love that you're calling out the notion of sort of surprisal, right? Claude Shannon used that term when he was talking about information theory. The predictable parts of a message are not the interesting parts. It's the parts that don't fit the pattern. That is the information in the message, right? That was sort of always his view on it. And I think that works a lot of ways in sort of information theory beyond, like just in nature and other things.
I was just going to say, so the interesting part there is really kind of the idea that, and you kind of swung around towards it at the end, but the idea that the way you build software is to try and make it perfect, right? So that it's exactly what's happening and all that kind of stuff like that. And that really, I find, is one of the hardest patterns of thought to really get rid of here, because it's never going to be perfect, right? And the belief that you can make it perfect, right, is really what leads you into this analysis, this enterprise grade analysis paralysis, where you get these year-long decade-long programs and projects, right, that really never arrive because they're really stuck in this, well, we have these edge cases. Well, the edge cases are where you learn, right? The edge cases are where you evolve, right? And if you look at all edge cases as bad and needing to be gotten rid of, right, you can't change. There's no adaptability. You have to look at edge cases as opportunity. Maybe good opportunity, maybe bad opportunity, but that's where your system is going to change.
I have this kind of armchair theory that I've never explored fully, and that is, I think one of the dangers we have in computing history, like modern computing history from the 50s and 60s onward, is so much of our computer system advancements were spurred on by the space program in the United States and in Russia too, I think. And in the space program in the United States, surprise was the enemy, right? Everything needed to be predictable, so that we made sure that people didn't die, so that we made sure we reached the goal we wanted to. And we designed systems to purposely be closed loop systems so that we could make them as grokkable as we could possibly make them. You know, the computer systems that sent humans to the moon were very, very simplistic compared to the kind of computer systems that we had today. Switches and knobs that turned things on. There were no screens and all that kind of stuff. So I think we kind of have this legacy of what quality software is and what software project management is, and it's driving out variability. We also use this notion of driving out variability in manufacturing, right? Driving out variability is kind of what the Intel Corp did when they made chips, right? Because it was very expensive to manufacture chips. So I think we get stuck in that loop, and I think both of you have kind of touched on this idea that the model becomes sort of the closed system or the way we think about it. And if we can kind of constrain that in a way that keeps it all grokkable, we feel better. But of course, that's not what nature does. That's not what healthy systems do. They, like you talk about, Michael, they have this ability to adapt in some kind of way. A good system, a complex system, is always broken at some point, but it continues operating anyway. Yeah, it continues operating anyway, right? That's a resilient kind of system, right? Even though this part's not fully functional, the rest of the system's working. That's how we can move machines in and out of a network, how we can add, change networks and add microphones and add all these other things, because the system is resilient enough to keep on going. So I think we're all kind of circling that same kind of activity, right? Is what is a healthy system? What is healthy system design? And what constitutes a way to build something that has that resilience and evolvability and adaptability to it?
Yeah, and that's really kind of the interesting part. And you know, we've kind of been tiptoeing around this whole idea of hypermedia and, you know, kind of talking to AI, different aspects of it, machine learning or generative, or, you know, all the long list of different approaches to it, right? But if you look at it, you know, data and AI, data and hypermedia, right? They're really both talking about getting higher up that stack to go from data and level towards understanding insight, meaning, right? So the idea is really to get what's the meaning behind these kind of things, really. And that's really where the big overlap is that I see, is it's trying to take atomic particles, right, and really assemble the big picture, right? Let's really try to see the human instead of just the pile of atoms that makes them up, or some particles. No,
that's a really good idea. I like that idea. Maybe, are you saying kind of maybe a lot of what we practice as designers or as programmers or as architects, maybe we're a little too far down on the design scale? Maybe is that kind of what you're saying? Are we spending too much time with the atoms and not enough time with the aggregate?
A lot of effort is spent missing the forest for the trees. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
So last year I did a series about complexity together with Smart Work Hour, and we had several podcast interviews also around that. And so one of the pet peeves of Mark is that there's this inherent reductionism that we have in the way our society today thinks about the world. And this reductionism is pervasive. It's everywhere.
There's a push and pull, right? So yeah, we have this tendency to think that understanding what's inside the works of the watch, right? Like where the gears are and stuff is really important to understand. We've had all these, and it isn't, I mean, we talk about reductionism, but it's also abstractionism, right? It's like, I want to think of the universe like it's a watch.
How do you feel
everything
about the
sort of
simplification, right?
Right. I want to kind of come up with a simple model, a model that I already understand, and sort of place it on top of, right? So it's a little bit of that, but it's also, I think, what you're pointing out is I use the phrase already today, the sum is equal more than its parts. Like we're more than willing to accept the notion that if you assemble things correctly, some kind of magical thing happens. Like there's something like, boy, you couldn't have recreated that, or that's really incredible how they reinforce each other, the amplitude and the modulation, or whether we have all sorts of examples of that in nature as well. So I think to kind of go back to what you were talking about, Christoph, I think we want to understand what's inside, and sometimes I'm putting words in Michael's mouth here, but sometimes maybe we get a little too excited about what's inside and don't pay attention to the larger picture, and we miss some really key elements of the story, or we miss the so-called magic that we're looking for, because we're too busy staring at the minor parts and not taking in the bigger picture. Does that make any sense? I don't know.
Yeah. No, I think that, getting the idea that I'm going on there about is, the idea is that, complex systems need to be simplified, and we need to have simpler models for our feeble human minds to really kind of comprehend and kind of work them out right there. All models are wrong. But the idea is to get someone and find some that are useful for you to kind of understand the system. And for a long time, I kind of butted my head against the notion that, people are going to always, be reductionist against it. And instead I've kind of pivoted to try and work with that and understand how to de-risk that, and how to kind of go with the notion that people are going to be reductionists. So how is this an opportunity rather than a roadblock?
Yeah. Actually, that's so. I that's a fascinating comment too. Sort of meeting people where they are, not spending extra energy trying to prevent, and instead use that energy. It's almost like a jujitsu, right? It's like, okay, if people are going to think like this, how can I take advantage of that interest, that curiosity, that skill, that ability, that desire to get closer to what we're looking for, right? Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So the energy is, I know how to do this, and actually my talk at API Days was kind of going in, an example of kind of what's happened recently. But I talk a lot about socio-technical systems, and the people are part of the system that you're designing for. So the process must match what you're building. So the best way to really do it is, convergent or co-evolution of both of them towards an ideal state. And you really kind of shape and take that energy into designing the optimal people process along the same lines while you're designing and building the technical process, so that you can weigh them both simultaneously to kind of come to a conclusion of what's the best socio-technical system, right? Which is usually not the optimal technical system or, business system, right? It's some, somewhere between or around that, where you find the optimal socio-technical system, and take that energy really and have them kind of go with it. And then you get to be a co-stakeholder there with the business and say, hey, this is a thing that needs to happen from a technical perspective. But we're really trying to build a system that's really observable and understandable, so that we know and it's interacting in a way that we understand, instead of having to, go into getting way down into the weeds, but observability and traces and all these details about which microservice or whatever, software or platform or whatever is going on, having to get really down into the weeds of the data level, right, of each step and hop function. what's happening? Like, what was the customer trying to do? They're trying to update their password, right? Did it get expired, or are they being hacked, or what is it? Like, let's get to the meaning. Let's start from there, and we'll work backwards so that we can try and avoid this forest for the trees kind of situation where we're worried about connecting two systems, and we're going to connect all these kind of properties. But 80% of those properties are either something nobody cares about, or only existed because of legacy constraints or legacy systems it was connected to, right? It's just not needed now, right? We just don't want it. So how do we not bring that forward? How do we simplify?
Yeah, we may not want it, but maybe we recognize that some system needs it, like identifiers or dates and timestamps or something.
Mm-hmm.
And let's just hide those. Let's just not expose those, and make those a part. We'll make those a part of the fabric kind of situation, right? So you focus on your
implementation
intent, right?
detail rather than interface or exposure kind of detail.
Right. Yeah, I definitely get that. And I think that's a lot of where I think of the notion of hypermedia affordances. Like, I think we're talking about the same thing, the sense of like, what's your intent, or what's the action you want to commit? That's the affordance I want to create, right? I want to create the onboard new user. One of the things that I'm hearing, and I think about this as well, when you talk about this notion of what's important and what's not, and trying to capture intent or meaning. That's kind of the way I think of hypermedia affordances. Like, I want to create affordances that actually are in context, that are in your domain. So this is the onboarding affordance, or this is the change password affordance, or this is the release new version affordance, or whatever. In other words, what I bury, right, the metadata that I bury, or the implementation details that I bury, have to do with things like post and put and get and HTTP and headers and so on. Like, I don't want people to be talking about that. I want I want them to be able to focus on their domain, to the point where a couple of years ago I actually built a command line tool, a REPL, which kind of does that. It has its own internal language, and you can type a phrase. You can say, call this URL, and then with the form that's called create, use the data in memory to add another record to the system. Like, you literally type something like that. So you don't type gets or puts or HTTPs or URLs or any of that kind of stuff. You actually talk about like forms that are named certain things, or links that are named certain things, and you add data along the way. So all of this kind of is, in a way, trying to level. I think, Michael, you said this early on, sort of coming up a level, kind of like leveling up a little bit. And I think that's where this notion of talking about affordances is really key. And then that's, I think, what AI wants us to do, right? Is it gives us this ability to be, the current round of generative AI gives us ability to speak in language that we understand and still get some results from machines. That's kind of the way I think about it anyway. I don't know if that's, did I kind of characterize what you were thinking of, Michael, or is that something different?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I think that's the real crux of it, right? Is that the notion behind affordance-centric APIs, affordance-driven APIs, right, is really kind of bringing the semantic level up from a data interaction, right, to more of a language, right? Like, this is really like language-oriented APIs. And these generative AI tools are really accomplishing the same goals. And there's really a lot of overlap there where you can leverage those tools, right? If you can feed them a bound language, right? Something that they can kind of incorporate into their model, custom model, or even a generic one, right? Or a way to discover a bound language for them to understand and interpret. You can prepare your system and actually make your system really kind of, ready and almost, generative AI enabled, to really make it far more discoverable than current CRUD or, what people call REST APIs, where you have to then try and get that model to somehow wade through the false equivalence of property names, or putting together the equivalence of disparate names to kind of get that meaning across, right? And that's just really unlikely to come from that level with those models. But if you let the implementation details of it go, and you really kind of make it more of a language or vocabulary driven experience in your API with hypermedia, you almost enabled for this interaction model, because the generative AI's point is to target that level of interaction with humans. So it's really a lot of synergy and really kind of trying to operate at the same level.
So, and I think my question here then is, how do we create APIs that are ready for this? How do we I've started talking about this concept of AI readiness. So instead of because everybody's busy with how can I slam AI into my software or into my system so that I can do some magical stuff. But I think that the real question probably is not, what kind of way I'm going to use AI in a really small way. I think if you're thinking about how you can use AI AI as the shortening for machine learning and large language models and all of that stuff. But how can we get ready for it? What is the groundwork that we need to do with our data models, or with the interfaces that we've designed, or the way that we're designing interfaces to be ready to enable this kind of affordance-based interaction?
Well, I'll volunteer the first shot on this, because I have also been thinking about the same idea. One of the things that I've really pushed over the years is this idea of separation of concerns, sort of the original separation of concerns idea. How can you look at this different ways? So and sort of the famous phrase that I repeat is, your data model is not your object model, is not your resource model, is not your affordance model. And that is, these are all separate models that you can kind of mix and match. So what I've been working on is this notion of the interface being different for different contexts. So your interface for humans is different than the interface for bots. Interface for AI is different than interface for a just simple repetitive script, right? So you design interfaces differently. You still have the same intents, but you might express them in different ways. So I'm going to be curious to see how our latest rounds of AI tools behave and succeed at certain things. I'm interested in AI not as a decision maker. Don't use AI to tell me where, what restaurant to go to, or what person to marry, or what job to take, or that kind of thing. But I'm interested in using AI to help me sort through lots of things. Help me understand this large corpus of data. Help me understand all the, what are the possibilities that I have here. So creating interfaces that allows AI to tell others more about the possibilities, more about what can be done, more about the ramifications maybe, even the consequences of what you do, I think are going to be super, super valuable. So I'm trying to create interfaces today that allows humans make choices. There are lots of things you can do at this point in the game, rather than simply follow a script or follow a little, follow the breadcrumbs kind of thing. And so now I want to make it possible for AI to do that as well. How can AI help us understand possibilities and consequences, and then how we make our own decisions with it? That's what I'm thinking anyway.
I have one question there. I kind of want to follow up on, you're saying, interface is different. Now, not to get too for kind of the different, let's say, actor or consumer. So are you talking about, let's say, the server or client, just at the highest level there?
What I'm really talking about is how you express the current state of things. So simple representation differences are HTML and JSON and XML and Uber and Mason and HAL, and those are different ways to express the same thing, right?
So you're talking about the messaging, the in between.
Yeah. And then you could also do it much more fundamentally. So you could do GraphQL, or you could do HTTP, or you could do MQTT, or you could do protobuf, right? These are also different ways to express the same thing, right? I could be expressing the same set of tasks. So now I'm saying you could do humans, or you can do generative AI, or maybe you could do some other learning model kinds of machine learning, something like that. You might implement the details differently in order to better fit the target audience, so to speak. So that's kind of what I'm thinking. I'm thinking that we need to be flexible in. It's sort of, I'm borrowing this now, but it's sort of like I think you were talking about earlier. Like, how can we meet halfway? How can I meet you where you are, rather than try to get you to think the way I think? How can I can I design something that is closer to the way you think or behave or act or expect? That's what's in my head right now.
That's really interesting. And I see a lot of parallels. I think we landed in a slightly different, I would say, fractal layer or space kind of in the stack. But I think that we're really both kind of looking at it in very similar ways. And the way that I'm looking at this is really, understanding the strengths and the weaknesses of that kind of user experience. And you described the intent right there, where my approach is kind of going is really enabling generic user agents for different kind of systems. So a generic user agent for, let's say, iOS or for web, or, you got your Android, or in this case, a generative AI, right? Like, so different ways to kind of enable, right, that system and really kind of plug in as a way to use a common way to describe and expose the available affordances in the system. And whereas, you may look at different ways of kind of addressing or looking at resources or designing interfaces. My approach has really been to really go far down the lines of the resource is a thing, and there are different views and perspectives that you can have over at different states, and will accept different messages. And that's really the state of that kind of resource representation model of whatever part of the system that it's performing. And the idea is to enable the different user agents, right? The generic user agents for these different types of consumers, to kind of enable the experiences, right, that are, tailored fit for those kind of things, to really make sure that the separation of concerns, the responsibility, lies where the domain system says it should. Gave the previous example of like updating a version number on the document or something like that, or releasing it. That really isn't something the consumer should be doing. Shouldn't ever be in the message that a consumer is sending to the server. That's something the server owns the responsibility over, right? So if you release a document, that's a consequence of that affordance being exercised, right? Yeah. The intent is the users to provide, right? I want to do that, and any data that's necessary to express that intent. But it's not something that the version number is not something that they should be providing. It should really just be a kind of almost an event sourcing kind of a way of, it's a consequence.
Yes,
not something you provide.
It's exactly what I was thinking. It's a consequence.
It starts to feel, or one thing that really piqued my interest was this idea that different interaction mediums need different constraints around the affordances, or different incarnations or different implementations of. Well, it is really different constraints, like different, like GraphQL versus REST APIs and so on and so on. But it sounds a little bit, Michael, like you're saying that actually it should be more a generic way that we should be designing these systems, or are you also in the boats that's like actually there's different, or where I'm trying to get is like if people are looking at. So there's this whole hype thing going on with APIs. With AI, Like, what do I do with this? How, like, we don't feel ready to make a big leap and make a huge investment and maybe we fail, but at the same time we don't want to stand still and then like in 5 years suddenly like, oops, we missed the boat, and this is probably the biggest boat we're going to see, or one of the biggest boats we'll see in our lifetime, or possibly because we still don't know. but it could be a really huge boat. So this could be as big as the launch of the internet potentially, because it's a completely different paradigm of how we're interacting with the world around us and with organization. What's the right standard for people to use to make those affordances available for AI purposes? Yeah, did you already have an idea about that? Is that already coming up, or this is still unclear?
So I don't think the right standard exists yet. And I think that what I'm working on, right, not that I'm quite able to talk about all of the details of it just yet, but is a step down that line. But really, I think the notion and looking at this from an enterprise perspective is kind of looking at and starting to build your domain vocabulary and your processes, and looking to kind of solidify the understanding and the meaning, getting rid of the ambiguities that are definitely within your current understanding of the system, undocumented or fuzzy documented, that you have there, because those are going to be the big pitfalls. So if you're looking to be prepared for this opportunity here, you have to kind of look and understand what are the pitfalls of this kind of technology. I mean, we're certainly on the hype train right now there. But the trough of disillusionment is quickly coming, and we're starting to see a lot of signs of it already, because, as organizations, you got, Samsung had, all their internal stuff leaked because people were using it so much. There are downsides and pitfalls, and the hallucinations is another big negative that comes up with the systems. Do you know it's true? Is it what it's spitting out? It seems like it's the right answer, but do you know it is? So being prepared to, let's say, facilitate or bridge that meaning gap, because the tools don't really understand the meaning, right? They're just statistical models that have a high probability and guess really well. It's a very, very complicated random number generator for answering what looks like a query. They don't understand what the question is. So if you can give the tool the guardrails to help bridge that gap, to provide that extra meaning gap bridge kind of tooling or scaffolding, that would really kind of prepare you for it. And that's really where I think the semantics and the domain vocabulary is really going to play a part in really enabling your system to be effectively utilized by let's say generative AI or large language model tools, or not.
Well, again, as I had kind of started out this part of the conversation, I really think of the client applications as the drivers, right? The service applications provide, we'll do tasks for you, right? If you'd like to release a new version, if you'd like to onboard somebody, if you'd like to update this particular account or user or whatever, we're happy to do that. And then it's up to the service to explain it to the client applications in a way that client can understand.
Absolutely.
Now, we've been very, very lucky for the last 30 years that people understood that client to be the browser. And they understood the programming language for that client to be essentially HTML markup with some sprinklings of JavaScript and CSS. So we've had a fantastic run for the last 30 years of being able to use the same client to do accounting as we are playing video games, right? We can make that client, we can express all those things in a way the client understands. Now, the challenge we have, I think, is that our reach is outstripping our grasp. In other words, we want to do many more things, and we want to do more things with less effort, or there are all sorts of possibilities we'd like to do. So people are building other kinds of clients and building other kinds of formats to try to talk to those clients. I think we've got a terrible one-to-one match on most of these clients and formats. And I like what I hear Michael saying, in the sense that, let's think about sort of the generic approach. I think there are lots of other clients that we could build besides the browser that could be multi-use, that could do the equivalent of accounting versus video games. And AI could probably help in a lot of that. So I definitely want to see more and more of that. At the same time, Michael kind of touched on this. The large language model systems that we're using today are just, the phrase is stochastic parrots, right? They're figuring out the statistical probability that the next word you want to hear is something, right? So whether it's a spell checker, or whether it's the completion of your email phrase, that you repeat over and over again, or it's explaining to you the meaning of a novel like Moby Dick, these are all just repeating things that somebody else has kind of put into the bucket. There's the only examples we've been able to find so far of actually adding new material to this huge corpus. The word large is important, large language model. The only examples we got of adding anything new are the hallucinations. Right? That's the only new stuff, and they're not useful. They're entertaining sometimes, but they're not very useful.
I want to catch on that one, because there's some emergent capabilities that people are, at least that I've read reports on, like, suddenly this LLM is now able to, what was it? Like, it learned a new language without actually being taught, and stuff like that. Isn't that emergent behavior?
It may be. I think you're referring to a Facebook story about a year ago, where they said they had programmed a kind of a model to do translations, and it turns out that this model, this system, actually invented its own intermediate language that nobody understood, as a way to make it easy to translate to something else. So it was sort of a universal translator project, and it resulted in a surprisal, which was that it invented a language along the way that made it easier to do the rest of its work, which I think is great. I'm happy to see more of that.
That's interesting parallels to the approach that I'm taking with hypermedia. That's interesting.
Right.
Interesting.
Right, Michael. We'll talk. I mean, I think it's worth exploring just what you said. So how I characterized Christoph's story, and I may have missed it, right? But I had read about this thing at Facebook where they were creating a translator, and the translator ended up creating its own sort of mid-language between everything else. So it started to translate all the inputs into this mid-language, and then on demand, it would turn the mid-language to some output. That's the way I understand that story. Listeners may be able to correct that with some links, but I think that's pretty close. Michael, how does that sort of fit with the way you're thinking about the way you're designing systems and your generic kind of client, if I'm characterizing it correctly?
So the goal is to enable standard and consistent means regardless of the client, right? It's to enable a generic, working with Henry Andrews, the term kind of we finally landed on was a generic hypermedia user agent. And that's really kind of this intermediary thing that allows you to kind of, let's say, the last mile extend towards what is that user agent kind of capability. So the intermediary is extremely standard and strict, but what is exposed to the kind of user experience based on user agent can be very different. So one of the things that we can enable, and I can talk about, is that, from an affordance discovery of it, simply just sending links and information and such with simple HTTP link headers, we're able to render an experience. We'll be able to render a simple form from just that, right? To be able to do things, we can render a representation of typing, right, which is based upon the actual domain language. We can even do things like multi-step tutorials or kind of processes or applications, let's say a bank account or something. And there's a bunch of different ways that we can kind of do that. Well, behind the scenes, that's really just kind of interacting and managing and sending a bunch of different affordances to the back end. But transmission of the meaning, the affordance, the capability is really very generic, regardless of the case and the scenario. It's what the client then chooses to do with that message and meaning and information, where the opportunity is, right? Kind of take the standardization, complicated, right? Complex system of many links and different pieces of metadata, standardize that, encapsulate it, so that what you're talking about is, okay, we have that ability. So what do we want to do with it in this case where, let's say a generative AI or and then kind of large language model or other kind of usage? What can we do with this as an enabler, as a starting place? Where can we go from here? What is this user agent or this system? What capabilities does this expose? So let's not, make it pay attention to all these other details that are the plumbing that are strict and all that stuff. Let's be very concise and let's hide that. I'm very, is a lot going on there, but let's just hide it and abstract it away. How does this large language model really take this and run with it and create even new value that we didn't even think about before?
That's the part I'm really fascinated by. Is most of this, you're seeing this language model being applied on the client side, right? Or no?
I look at so yes on the client side, right? Like ways to interact with it. I look at the systems as conversational, right? Regardless of human or machine, right? Or different type of machine, right? However that ends up working. I look at it as an interaction, as a conversation, right? One party gets to express, or many parties get to express, right? And collaborate. So if we have this means of providing a language, regardless of, your identity as a user or a consumer, that it's the same, right? We create an observable system, but we also enable people to kind of bypass all of the boilerplate, let's say, complicated, but boilerplate, and get right to the meat of it, of really driving business and domain value, and then utilizing the capabilities of unique user agents. So very conversational.
I'm going to interject here. We mentioned Facebook because of their AI model. It was originally called, I think it was NLLB 200 or so. They had some kind of numbers, had a number of languages that they were translating.
Rolls off your tongue, huh?
Oh yeah, it was real. They're just internal project, whatever the case may be. But one of the things that Facebook did, which affected all of us, almost a decade ago now, was creating this idea of data graphs, right? Of GraphQL, right? That was their creation. And they were trying to solve this problem that services couldn't keep up with the demands of what clients wanted custom built, right? So they said, here, look, we're going to expose a way for you to go directly at the data models, and you can create your own interface on the client side. You can create whatever you want to create. It's a very data-centric approach, and it worked really well internally because it's a data-driven company. Now, what I'm hearing, and I may be, putting vastly more into this than you really intend, but what I'm hearing, Michael, from you is almost the equivalent, but on an intent or action or affordance level. Like clients can now compose a resource that has the affordances they want, or they can link affordances, or they can use services in a series of ways that are solving client problems that are not necessarily something that servers even know or care about. Servers are just doing kind of what they're supposed to do. Is that close, or am I just way overreading what you just described?
I think you're about one step farther than where I'm going, because
I'm way overboard.
No, I do mean one is because it's a very difficult problem. But I think that where I see this going is really kind of one step short of that, because I don't know if that last step is off the cliff or still on stable ground. And that's really enabling incremental, fast evolution of the system, insight from the system, observability at the core allows you to quickly add and refine the language that is available so that you can address and add new things. And that's really a fast follow activity off of, let's see, you know, if in this scenario, you've got the real high level language stuff, but that's failing. So people are falling down to a very CRUD interaction, right? That provides you the opportunity to go and do an interview. What is it you're trying to accomplish here, right? That's making you fall down to this so that you're kind of falling out of the affordance to a lower layer. And what can we do to enable it? So one step short of that saying, hey, this is my affordance, you go do it. That looks like that's a capability that in the future, you may be able to leverage generative models to do, provided they understand enough of a language, right? And you have enough guardrails.
Yeah.
But right now, the goal is to really kind of enable you to be able to look at our system and say, okay, definitively, this is what you're looking for. I know the consumer, I can go talk to them, see what it is, and how do I make it better so they don't have to do that? So I can make it more self-serve for them. And I have to kind of course, caveat all of this is that I come from the background of a lot of finance and banking. So the risk appetite in the industry is not the same as you know you're going to find in a lot of Silicon Valley. So there is a requirement of knowledge where that falls outside the risk profile. Could people in other industries where maybe a buggy implementation that comes out of generative AI make that leap and test it? Absolutely. Just don't know if the organization that I'm working with right now is that candidate for that based on, you know, we don't want to lose any customers' money.
Yeah. Well, I think the reason I asked that was, you know, right now I'm kind of working towards allowing humans to do sort of the GraphQL equivalent of this, right? Like the humans can compose what they want and humans can create a series of steps. You know, I'm not expecting a machine to actually understand how to assemble an automobile, right? Or like there's a bunch of parts lying around. You can go ahead and build a car if you like, or you can build a boat or whatever. I'm not expecting machines to do that at this point. I know that's kind of the way we think about it, right? In the web agent world or the robot world, we call that planning, right? The planners, like you give them a bunch of things and say, you know what, somewhere in here is a car, build one. I love the way Steve Wozniak, the Apple co-founder, talks about AI in this way. He says, you want to test an AI system, test a robot, put a robot outside your house and say, go inside and make coffee. And now think of all of the decisions that have to be made, the discernments, the understanding, the observations, the assumptions, that all those things in order to actually solve that problem, right? That is a problem beyond anything we know about right now in the AI stuff, the ML stuff that we're seeing, right? Now, the version today is have 2 million robots trained on how to make coffee, right? And then put it in a large language model and then have somebody type in, how do you make coffee? Right? And then it kind of comes up from all those millions and millions of attempts.
Mechanical
it gives you one. It gives you one of those. That's what large language models do today, right? Somebody has to feed all that stuff in. Unfortunately, those somebodies are people today. It's another topic. But so I also am like, I'm kind of leaping ahead on a couple of steps, but I'm trying to create systems that make it possible for humans to be successful planners of their own solution, sort of using that Donald Norman idea of a well-designed object is one that allows people to do things with it the designer never intended.
Absolutely.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure where the AI might come into that in terms of making it easier for a human to do that, like finding all the ones. Hey, can you tell me all of the services that actually handle credit cards? You know, stuff like that. But it may at some point actually say, hey, can you just go ahead, you know my preferences for shirts, go buy me 5. That's a long way to go. That's making coffee.
Michael, what you were talking about was about removing ambiguity, getting really, really crystal clear about meanings and like mapping out the domain and making sure that this internal coherence inside of your organization about what do we mean when we say X, and how are we going to expose that to the outside world in a coherent and comprehensive way. But then how does that map to this affordance model? Because so one of the core things that I found really fascinating when I first learned about affordances, and it might even have been in Edinburgh at Fest when you were talking about it, Mike, was this idea that an affordance is the complex thing that happens between like it's a technical thing, a tool, and a human or a set of people. It's like a social practice thing where it's the combination of both what we know and how we interpret things, and the person that is interacting with something and the thing itself that creates the possibilities that the thing has. Now, but this is not about removing ambiguity. This is about like reconstraining what is there with new models and new ideas to keep on exploring what are the possibilities, and then to find some of those and then to start spreading those in society, because like affordances is also like it's a social thing. It really is a social technical thing. What's the translation between these two, and how like if we want to provide a generative AI model, even if it hasn't been trained on those affordances, because I think, one step back. One thing I think I'm seeing is that we're trying to do everything in the generative AI model, and I think that's the wrong approach. I think that the generative AI model is an interface to the interfaces, and it's a tool that is able to translate maybe your language to the language that is being used by the receiving party, that then can hook into the interfaces that the receiving, or that's the provider or the receiving party, has made available to do certain stuff, to make certain affordances available to the community, or to those people that are interacting with them. But what is the way that we do this?
So there's really kind of two kind of key aspects here in different ways that the generative AI that I see can be kind of used. It's really the discovery side, right? The consuming side and making the systems discoverable, but it's also in the generative side, right? In defining it, and being very, very specific, right? And removing ambiguity from the system doesn't necessarily mean you can't use generative systems, because kind of at the core of the real generic approach is, this notion of, dog fooding or bootstrapping, right? Like an affordance it's part of the core vocabulary that the platform is built on, and all the other vocabularies are really, extensions for that. So what at the core of the approach is really the ability to create a bound extension vocabulary. Fully bound is important. This is a difference related to, a lot of the semantic web kind of technologies. That's a very technical detail there. Discussion about that, but it's about enabling the creation of new semantics, right? By maintenance of it. So generative AIs can be, being specific in creating the new semantics, but they also can be then very specific about discovering things that they don't know before, right? That kind of general knowledge, right? And the ability to then discover and then be a natural language on an interface, right? A bunch of systems. And this is a thing that enables that layer to exist, because you then end up with this whole socio-technical version of a mechanical Turk where you get a developer in the middle of it, right? And so every N+1 system that you want to consume with this approach, it requires this one-off. It requires this integration step and whatever. And this is really about making it discoverable so that there's a generic way of discovering and interacting and using things, so that you don't need that human intermediary step to make a system usable on first interaction. You don't update your google.com, right? And you don't want to have that happen for a generative AI system that's going to be making use of some other API system. So the idea is about really enabling the capability to create and define these terms and these words, to be specific about it. And there's conventions around requiring the specifics of these affordances, right? It's really this potential capability that you're trying to expose, and a way to describe the system.
So I understand the need for a bank, like a financial institution, to fully control what is going to be done with their system, and to make it unambiguous, and actually probably you don't want surprises, or you don't want too many surprises there in what people are doing with your systems, or at least there are certain areas like bank transactions where you really don't want surprises to happen. But this goes a little bit counter to what we were talking about earlier. That's a really good system has these unexpected affordances, or a really well-designed tool or system will have new affordances that are waiting to be discovered by people. And is there a contradiction here, or you don't see that contradiction?
Not really, but maybe it's, two Weasley explanations out. First off, this is really kind of an extensible system. So I kind of hinted at it, you're bootstrapping, right? The system is defined by a set of a schema for what is an affordance, some conventions on how it displays metadata information, and what is a resource and what is a message. That's really more or less kind of like the core fundamentals of it. So you can always extend the system as consumer, because one of the other things that you can do, right? Let's take, for example, within our organization is you can add a new message, right? So we have the affordances of interacting and creating affordances, and message schemas and information. So you have the means of kind of creating this kind of thing. Maybe not necessarily implementing, but you have this means of kind of creating this new message and discovering and talking about it within the system. How to go from the step of I've defined it to, I think that there's a lot of opportunity to take generative AI systems and say, okay, well, I understand this language, and I have this massive corpus of words, so I can maybe generate a implementation off of here and in kind of this test space where we'll see if this kind of does what you intended. I see a lot of opportunity in there to kind of go that, whether it's immediately interactive or not. I think it's a matter of kind of closing that loop and gaining confidence within your context that it is sufficiently correct out of the gate to kind of be able to immediately leverage it. And of course, the second out is that, when we're kind of building kind of these systems here, it's for an institution. It's not for, like the solving everybody's problem. We also do have kind of the CRUD kind of affordances, which are really hard to handle, hard to manage, to fall back on, right? And then close the loop as a follow-up activity or incremental iterations.
Mike, do you have something?
Well,
maybe.
Yeah, I have the luxury of not actually being responsible for billions of dollars, so I can speak much more vaguely. I think some things that come to mind are when you're dealing with sort of enabled agents, right? Like if you say, I want a client application that's able to discover affordances and use them. There are a couple of things that you automatically can build into resilient systems. And one of them is discovering does not necessarily make it eligible for use. In other words, discovering the possibility might mean I tell my human, you know what, I was going through here and I found this really cool service. this really cool endpoint. Maybe you should check that out, right? So that's one of the ways you can design your agents. You can design your agents to not necessarily, run into the dark cave the very first time it sees it. The other one is even if you allow, if you sort of mark affordances that are discoverable in the system as eligible for use, you can create, boundaries like, well, you can't use share my personal information affordance with open up a bank account affordance or something like that, right? You can also set some other rules inside your agents. There are just vast possibilities. When you start thinking about using affordances and hypermedia and AI together, what you're really doing is you're creating a world, you're creating a game, and you set the rules about what you can, how many affordances you can carry around in your kit bag and how often you can use them and whether or not you can survive or you get killed off, or, this is what we're going to be designing. This is what we're going to be building. These web agents are going to be just like gamers.
Yes.
And that means that we have lots and lots of responsibility. The other thing that all services can do, all members of the gaming interface can do, is they can act defensively. And that is, I'm a web agent and I discovered this really new cool service and I'm about to use this service, and the service can say, no. I don't know who you are, right? So when we think of these things, these non-deterministic kinds of systems, we don't have to think of them without guardrails or without safety checks or all these other things. So I think we have lots of opportunity there, but that's pretty far down the road.
But this is the thing that I've been really thinking a lot about, is that there's a shift probably going to happen where if generative AI becomes the universal interface through which, or one of the universal interfaces through which we interact with computer systems, there is a shift happening from the world today where we are assuming that APIs are being consumed through applications, where we are authorizing a specific application to do something because we are expecting predictable behavior, because it's an app that we already know, and we assume that it's always going to keep doing the same kind of things, and it's not suddenly going to start utilizing new affordances with the same endpoints that it's touching upon. And it feels to me, one thing that I've been thinking a lot about is that there's the shift going to happen where we're going from, you look for an app and you install it, and now that's your app you're using to interact with the bank with, or to get or whatever app you're utilizing, to you're interacting with this much more broader application, a lot like the whole Tencent WeChat kind of model, where there's a single thing that does all the things, and you're authorizing this single thing with all these affordances, which is actually kind of scary. And then in that world, we need a very different model to clamp down and to limit what people are going to be doing with APIs. And it needs to shift more to what is the intent you have? What is it that you're trying to do here? And I'm going to authorize that one use. I'm going to authorize you in this context, in this generative AI context. I'm going to authorize you to do this one thing one time right now, because I'm not sure that you're not going to use, somebody else is going to come and use the same generative AI agents to do something malicious after you've done this and you've authorized this agent. You also see that shift?
I see this as really a new frontier, and these are kind of two things that are kind of really interesting and really what's exciting to me. And there's a lot of space with how this will work and how these agents and Mike's kind of alluding to, I believe, his autonomous agents kind of stuff like that here. We don't have these answers yet, right? And that's kind of the exciting fun part, where we're really kind of creating a new mechanism, right? And then the advances in AI generative systems, right, are kind of one of the key prerequisites to kind of enable this whole new frontier. We don't really know where it's going to go. The way that I've kind of designed how this system works is really just the litmus test of what is necessary to enable a generic hypermedia user agent to provide these kind of capabilities without any a priori implementation understanding, which creates a lot of constraints. But one of the best things about constraints is that they create at the same time, right? Like that's where emergent behavior kind of comes from. And that's where all the opportunity in the future is going to come from, creating these constraints that enable this kind of garden to kind of grow. So that's what I find really exciting about this, these tools, is that we don't know how it's going to work. We don't know. We can see how it could help into the future, but we don't know every step of the way or what's going to happen and what it's going to look like exactly when you get there. But it certainly could be a huge value if we enable these systems, but leave the space open for what we don't know is going to happen right now.
It reminds me, I was talking earlier about, we don't have to not have guardrails, things like that. And this, it's the quote, the hardest part of creating software is not writing the code, it's writing the requirements. We can write the code. As a matter of fact, if you write the requirements well enough and accurately enough and detailed enough, you don't have to write the code, right? You can generate the code. So what we're really talking about now is, that's right, we're going to need requirements, right? And I think, writing prompts, by the way, writing prompts in, for GPT-4 or whatever these other, commercial ones, you're writing requirements. You're coding. You're doing the same thing.
You're coding in a new language, yeah.
Right, exactly. So that I think is definitely on the horizon. We're gonna see a sort of a shift toward requirements writing as a skill, understanding. We used to call them analysts. I think data analysts years ago or something like that. We kind of eschewed a lot of that activity and turned everybody into full stack programmers that were supposed to talk to the customer. But I think you're going to have a swing back to getting more skills about understanding requirements, and that's the design work. I mean, that's why I've spent so much time on my design first and design process modeling and all these other things, because it's all the requirements, it's all the upfronty stuff. But when you start to put agents in, as Michael's talked about it, as you talked about, Krista, then now you're going to need a whole nother set of requirements, because you need requirements about the agents and what the agents can do and cannot do. So I think, yes, we're definitely seeing a shift in that area. I think one of the other ones, if we're just listing them out, is I think we're dancing around this. We're talking about it a couple of different ways. We're going to see a lot more DSL activity, domain-specific language activity. We're going to be, because it's going to be so much easier for agents, whether they're autonomous or not, or AIs, whether they're machine learning or not, to be able to converse with us if we both share the same domain language of healthcare or insurance or banking or just parking ticket domain language. And once we're creating these languages, it's going to be another shift in the way we think about how we interact with computers. Back up until like the late 90s, there was all this talk about fourth generation languages. We're going to be domain-specific languages. But then with the popularity of C# and Java and these other languages, Rust and all these other things come later, they're much more generic. They're not domain-specific. So I think we're going to see a swing back to that as well. I think that's all part of where we're going now that we have these conversational interfaces, which are just so viral, right? Plus to open AI for figuring out how to make large language models viral. They've been around since 2015, 2016. What you do is you make it like you're playing a game. You make it like you're talking to Eliza from the 1970s or Perry, the paranoid schizophrenic program. Make them interactive, and we get the same hits, we get the same endorphins from playing with GPT that we do with gambling, because we're not sure what's going to come back, and it's so exciting when it does. Plus to them on that score.
I'll just kind of really tack on to what you're kind of saying here from the DSL perspective. And additionally, the kudos for kind of really making this obscure powerful, important, technology, really mainstream that everybody's interested in. I try to avoid the terminology, right? That kind of is off-putting and all that such. But I just describe it as the business language. We're just trying to be specific about the business language, so it's clear regardless of actor in there. But that's exactly what we're talking about. And whether you're designing the business language for a department, right? One specific use case for one group within the organization, or you're looking at it from industry-wide perspective. That's really what we're looking at enabling here, and that's the approach, is to kind of bring that level of interaction up from a data level. And I think the fourth generation languages really kind of haven't materialized yet, because really we haven't gone up the stack, right? Like the popularity of these other languages is kind of stuck because they're more optimal, or they features that are focused on optimizing kind of the third generation languages for the most part, making that more optimal. But really what's next is required is kind of a context switch to how you're thinking about systems. And in my experience in talking to a lot of people, and the way that they're kind of perceiving it, and they're looking at the problem from what they're working on, they are looking at the scope of the problem that is impeding them or is in their way. And looking at the semantics and the meaning of things is often not what you need to do in order to solve this data-centric problem you're solving. But it's this catch-22 of, you're often solving this data-centric problem that you have because you're trying to resolve a symptom of not having the semantics already defined ahead of time. This chicken or egg situation, where you define the language here, well, you really can't get to a fourth generation language that's really there until you get to having the semantics defined ahead of time. And humans thrive on ambiguity. It's kind of a fundamental construct of our language, right? We try to be as least specific as we can be, avoid conflict, all kinds of things, right? As humans, it's just like our communication MO. But it may be that the generative models, right, is ChatGPT is kind of maybe push the needle, where maybe there's enough of an incentive where people will start getting into the process of understanding it. I work with teams all the time and really kind of make converts out of them, of like, no, we don't define it. You're going to push our schedule. This is going to take forever. We just need you to do this. Change the dialogue to, well, what do you want your process to be? And what is stuff? Okay, well, we actually need to do this. And then you can make your process better and get rid of these three things that you're doing now, because they're data-centric steps. We can just get rid of them because you don't want to do them. And we're going to have to build this really immense, expensive, difficult technical piece to fix that problem. Or we fix the process and the technology and just change the problem that we're going after, evolve these two things at the same time to change the constraints, and we can go there. And that's all fundamentally centered around defining very, very specifically, right, the business language that we're talking about here. And that's what enables this kind of value to be delivered through these kind of hypermedia systems.
So we're getting to the end of our time slot. We had a really good run. Are there any last thoughts that you would like to leave, that you would like to get into the podcast? Like something, any new perceptions or new ideas that this has sparked in either of you?
Well, I'll just say that, as I expected, I've learned so much from Michael on your business language and leveling and things like this. This is very exciting to me. And Christoph, your view on AI and what's possible and where we could be going, I think is really, really encouraging. The way I think about this right now is, Christoph, you kind of alluded to it, this has the potential to be a major shift in the way we think. Like every potential, realizing that potential in a safe, responsible, and equitable way is going to be super, super challenging. And I'm looking forward to possibility of contributing in a tiny, tiny way to that kind of shift that turns out to be net positive for lots and lots and lots of people. So I'm very excited. It's a very interesting zone, and I'm sure I'll be talking about and hearing about it quite a bit very soon.
Thanks. Michael?
I'm still just, a bit inspired and a bit at a loss for words at kind of the opportunities. There's been a lot of kind of connection inspired here. Both points that you're both bringing up, and I find it just really exciting, and it was very, very interesting. It was a great discussion. I see so much potential in these kind of two things, and the thing that I find really the most interesting about this is that this may be the incentive that kind of enables people to kind of appreciate and kind of what I've said in the past is really kind of like the next kind of order of magnitude or two developers, right? Like raising that semantics layer of what a developer is, and someone who can define and create technical or socio-technical systems to a much, much broader audience. And what is a developer at that kind of level? This really could raise that group of people up, because they would no longer have to know all of the details of programming languages, right? To convert their intent into some binary based or for the computer understanding here. This and generative AI and other tools like this really could be the key to enabling that population growth to contribute and build these kind of systems, but also allow us to get over that hump to go from maybe early adopters into the broader, more mainstream audience to really be participating in building these kind of systems. I just see so much potential, and the consequences of a lot of what we've heard is inspiring.
I have a lot to think about. Like one of the key things that I'm going to carry away that I need to chew on is this idea, this unobvious idea that in a world where you have a less constrained interface through which you're interacting with systems, maybe we'll need a shift from apps to affordances, like an authorized affordances that you can have with my systems, or something like that. And I really want to chew on that. And I feel that we need some more time, maybe another time, to explore how the concept of hypermedia APIs, how that might actually be the best way of doing this kind of stuff. I also want to listen back to what you guys have been saying again and listen really deeply, because it's a very high abstraction level that we're going. Thank you very much, guys. This was amazing.
Thank you.
As I was fully expecting, lots of brain juices are flowing around, lots of new interesting ideas. Thank you very much for coming on board and for having this discussion in this medium.
Yep, it was a great experience, and I'm looking forward to hearing the results and keeping track of what both of you are doing. Thanks.
Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you.
That's it for this episode. This episode of the Resilience Podcast was brought to you by Pronovix. You can learn more about our company at pronovix.com. And thank you for listening. And until next week,